Where do you think you are taking her to? She demanded. Home, of course. She's little and needs help. You must be out of your mind, his wife retorted sharply. You want to take in an unknown child into our house? Have you forgotten so soon what happened to your best friend, Dave? Never will I allow you to destroy her home. Please, let's go home. Once upon a time, there lived a little girl named Sade. Sade's world had always been small but filled with love. She and her mother lived in a tiny house at the edge of the town. Despite their small existence, Sade's mother, Adebisi, ensured that their home was filled with laughter and love. Every morning, Adebisi would sing softly as she prepared their simple breakfast, and Sade would join her, their voices blending in sweet harmony. Adebisi worked tirelessly, taking on any job she could find to provide for her only daughter. She washed clothes, cleaned houses, and sometimes sold vegetables in the market. Her hands were always busy and her back always ached. But her heart was full of joy for her beloved daughter. Together, they faced the world, finding joy in the smallest of things: a shared meal, a kind word, a beautiful atmosphere. One fateful day, everything changed. Adebisi fell ill. At first, it was just a persistent cough, but soon it grew worse. Her strength began to wane and she struggled to get out of bed. Sade watched helplessly as the vibrant woman who had been her rock and all slowly faded away. With each passing day, Adebisi's condition grew worse. The cough became a constant, agonizing presence, and her once bright eyes grew dull with pain and exhaustion. Desperation clouded at Sade's heart as she saw her mother's health decline. Adebisi's once strong and capable hands trembled with weakness, and her voice, which had always been filled with warmth and love, now carried a note of sorrow and fear. Sade did everything she could to care for her mother, but she was just a little girl, powerless to stop her mother's illness. The little money they had quickly ran out. Adebisi could no longer work, and the meager savings they had were spent on basic necessities. The townsfolk, preoccupied with their own lives and struggles, offered no help. Sade knocked on doors, begging for assistance, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. A few gave her a little sum, while many others ignored her. They were alone, with no one to turn to. Sade would often sit by her mother's bedside, holding her frail hand and whispering words of comfort. Even as her own heart broke, Adebisi, despite her pain, would try to smile for Sade, telling her stories of hope and resilience, stories of how they would get through this together. But deep down, both of them knew the truth. Time was running out. One cold night, as the wind howled outside their house, Adebisi's breathing grew shallow and ragged. Sade clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, please, don't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Adebisi opened her eyes, looking at her daughter with all the love she could muster. "Sade, my sweet child," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "You must be strong. No matter what happens, remember that I love you." always. Sade nodded, her heart breaking into pieces. She held her mother close, feeling the warmth of her body slowly ebb away. As the night wore on, Adebisi took her last breath, her spirit slipping away into the darkness. Sade was left alone, clutching her mother's lifeless body, her world shattered beyond repair. The days that followed were a blur of sorrow and confusion for Sade. She had no idea what to do or where to go. She wandered the town, hoping that someone would take pity on her and care for her. But the townsfolk, fearful of getting involved and burdened with their own troubles, turned her away. She knocked on doors, but they remained firmly closed. She called out for help, but no one answered. Sade's heart ached with a loneliness she had never known before. She missed her mother's comforting presence, her soothing voice, her gentle touch. The world, once filled with love and warmth, now seemed cold and unforgiving. She was just a little girl, lost and alone, with no one to turn to. As the days turned into weeks, Sade's struggle to survive grew more desperate. She scavenged for food, picking through garbage bins, and begging for scraps. Her clothes became tattered and dirty, and her once bright eyes grew dull with exhaustion. One night, as Sade lay on her bed, feeling overwhelmed, she whispered into the darkness, "Mama, where are you? I need you, please, help me." But there was no answer, only the eerie silence of the night. Tears streamed down her face as she cried herself to sleep, her heart heavy with grief and longing. Sade's journey had only just begun, and the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty and hardship. But somewhere deep inside her, a small spark of hope still flickered. She clung to the memories of her mother, the love and strength she had shown, and vowed to keep going no matter what. For Sade knew that her mother would want her to be strong, to survive, and to find her way in the world. And so, with a heavy heart and a weary soul, Sade faced each new day, determined to honor her mother's memory and to find a place where she could belong. Sade's struggles to survive grew more intense with each passing day. Desperation gnawed at her young heart, driving her to seek out the family her mother had told her about, her father's family. Gathering all the courage she could muster, Sade made her way to the house of her grandparents. She stood outside the large, imposing structure, her small frame trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The memories of her mother's stories echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of determination. She knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, it creaked open to reveal her grandmother. Sade looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, Ma," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I am Sade, Adebisi's daughter. My mother, she's gone. I have no one left." The grandmother's eyes widened in shock. She stared at Sade, the resemblance to her son undeniable. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she stepped aside, allowing Sade to enter. They couldn't deny her, not when her face was a mirror image of their sons. Yet, their hearts were hardened by the past. They refused to take her into their home, offering her no shelter. Instead, they gave her their leftovers, the scraps from their meals. Sade's heart sank as she realized the truth. She was allowed to sit in the corner of their dining room, watching as the family ate their meals. She listened to their clinking of cutlery, the murmurs of conversation, her stomach growling with hunger. When the family finished eating, they would gather the remnants from their plates and hand them to her. Shade, starving and with no other options, accepted the food and ate in silence. Some days, they lied to her, claiming they hadn't eaten all day and had nothing to offer. Shade's heart broke a little more each time she heard those words. She understood their unspoken message. They didn't want her around. Their actions spoke louder than their words could ever. The weeks dragged on, and Shade's visit became less frequent. She understood now that they would never truly accept her. Her heart ached with the knowledge, but she wasn't entirely surprised. Her mother had prepared her for this in the stories she had told. Flashbacks of her mother's world filled Shade's mind. She remembered the tales of how her father had denied Adebisi's pregnancy, claiming he wasn't responsible. He had fled the town and no one had heard from him since then, leaving Adebisi to fend for herself. Desperate and alone, Adebisi had sought help from his parents, only to be turned away. They had supported their son, accusing Adebisi of lying. They called her irresponsible and useless and had thrown her out, warning her never to return. Adebisi had borne the burden alone, carrying Shade to term and raising her with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. She had never resurfaced near them, choosing to protect her daughter from their cruelty. With a heavy heart, Shade stopped visiting her grandparents. She roamed the streets, begging for food. She would sit by the roadside, her hands outstretched, hoping for a kind soul to take pity on her. Some days, she found enough to eat, but more often, she went to bed hungry, her stomach aching with emptiness. Despite the harshness of her circumstances, Shade never gave up hope. She held onto the memory of her mother's love, using it as a source of strength. She was determined to survive no matter what. She knew that somewhere out there, a better life awaited her, and she would keep fighting until she found it. Shade's life on the streets was a constant struggle. Every morning, she would rise with the sun, her stomach growling in hunger, and set out on a long, arduous journey. She walked miles, her tiny feet weary, begging for food or money. Each day blended into the next, a continuous cycle of pleading eyes and outstretched hands, hoping for the kindness of strangers. Most days, she managed to scrape together just enough to keep her going. The occasional piece of bread, a few money, a sympathetic smile. These small acts of charity were her lifeline, but the weight of survival bore down on her young shoulders, and each night she would return to her small house, exhausted and hungry, but determined to push through another day. One day, however, was particularly harsh. Shade had walked farther than usual, her thin legs trembling with fatigue. She begged at markets, knocked on doors, and approached strangers, and traveled too far from home. But it seemed as if an evil force shadowed her every step. Not a single person offered her help. She grew desperate, her stomach a hollow pit of despair. As the sun began to set, Shade knew she had to start the long trek back to her shelter. Her pockets were empty and she had no money for transportation. With a heavy heart and tired legs, she started the journey. The road seemed endless, stretching out before her like a cruel joke. Darkness enveloped her, and she found herself on a lonely, desolate stretch of road. Desperately, she waved her hands at passing cars, hoping for a good Samaritan. Car after car sped by, their occupants too afraid to stop. She could see the fear in their eyes, the hesitation in their gazes. She was a little girl, alone in the dark, and no one wanted to take the risk. Mr. Ben, driving home with his wife, saw Sade by the roadside. He slowed down, his heart aching at the sight of the frail, helpless girl. "We have to help her," he said, his voice resolute. His wife, however, was not convinced. "Where do you think you are taking her to?" she demanded. "Home, of course. She's little and needs help," Ben replied, glancing at Sade through the window. "You must be out of your mind," his wife retorted sharply. "You want to take in an unknown child into our house? Have you forgotten so soon what happened to your best friend, Dave? Never will I allow you to destroy her home. Please, let's go home." Ben remembered Dave vividly. Dave had once found a young boy by the roadside and, out of the goodness of his heart, had taken him home. The next day, the boy's parents accused Dave of kidnapping. Despite his innocence, Dave was dragged through a harrowing legal battle that nearly ruined his life. The stigma never fully left him, and his reputation was forever tarnished. Sade stood by the road looking at their car and praying for them to help her. Ben's mind raced, weighing his desire to help Sade against the fear instilled by his wife's words. He sighed deeply. "Okay, I won't take her home," he conceded, his voice tinged with regret. "But I'll take her to the nearest police station." His wife shook her head vehemently. "The police will just accuse you of being a kidnapper. You can't trust them. Let's go home, please." Ben's heart ached as he looked at Sade one last time. He wanted nothing more than to help her, to lift her out of her misery. But his wife's fear was palpable, and he couldn't ignore it. Reluctantly, he drove on, leaving Sade standing alone on the dark, lonely road. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the car's tail lights disappear into the night. Sade felt the weight of abandonment crush her spirit. The night grew colder, and she moved on, a small form barely visible in the darkness. She kept moving, one foot in front of the other, driven by sheer willpower. Sade continued her lonely trek down the dark road, her tears streaming down her face as she waved frantically at passing cars, begging for help. Her cries pierced the night, but fear and suspicion kept the cars speeding past her. The world seemed indifferent to her plight, and her heart sank deeper with every rejection. After what felt like an eternity, another car approached. The driver, Mr. Kola, noticed Sade in a pool of tears. Compassion gripped his heart, and he immediately felt the urge to help her. He began to slow down, but then a chilling memory surfaced. He recalled a friend's horrifying experience, how his friend had stopped to help a stranger by the roadside, only to be kidnapped and held for ransom. The family had to pay a huge sum for his release. Fear overpowered Mr. Kola's compassion, and he quickly sped off, unwilling to risk a similar fate. The stories of kidnappings were all too common in their town, and he couldn't afford to become another victim. As he drove away, he couldn't help but glance at his rear-view mirror, the image of Sade's tear-streaked face haunting him. Passers-by saw Sade and perceived her as a bait set by kidnappers. The fear of abduction was ingrained in their minds, and they couldn't fathom how a little girl would be alone on a dark, lonely road at night. The escalating rate of kidnappings in their town had made them weary, and they chose safety over compassion, speeding away from the perceived danger. Sade's legs ached, and her heart was heavy with despair. She kept walking and crying, hoping for the best. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, and she felt utterly forsaken. Just then, a car approached from a distance. The driver, a man named Mr. Bayo, saw Sade from afar and began to wonder who she was and why she was out so late. Compassion welled up within him, and he planned to stop and question her when he reached her. As he drove closer, Mr. Bayo felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. The stories of kidnappers using children as bait resurfaced in his mind, and he grew hesitant. He didn't want to become another victim, yet he couldn't ignore the girl's plight entirely. When he was almost upon her, he made a decision. Mr. Bayo slowed down and rolled down his window. "Little girl, take this money and go home to your parents now," he said, tossing a few amounts of money out of the window. His voice trembled with a mix of fear and concern. He didn't wait for a response, immediately speeding off, afraid that an attack might come from the bushes at any moment. Sade hurriedly picked up the money, her heart swelling with joy and relief. It was the first bit of luck she had encountered all day. Clutching the money tightly, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Her steps quickened, and soon she was running, eager to reach her house. As she approached the familiar sight of her home, the excitement within her began to wane. She realized with a sinking heart that all the shops had closed for the night. Her stomach growled loudly, but there was nothing she could do. She opened the creaky door and stepped inside, the darkness of her home matching the night outside. Lying on her bed, Sade's hunger gnawed at her insides. She could barely sleep. Her thoughts fixated on the money in her hand and the promise of food the next day. The night seemed to drag on endlessly, each hour a reminder of her empty stomach. She tossed and turned, desperate for the dawn to break. Finally, the first lights of morning filtered through the small window. Sade sprang from her bed, her hunger propelling her out the door. She raced to the nearest shop that had just opened, using a portion of the money to buy a loaf of bread. The bread felt warm and comforting in her hands, and she could hardly wait to eat it. Finding a quiet spot, Sade tore into the bread with intensity. She devoured it like a hungry lion, each bite a moment of pure bliss. The bread filled her stomach, but it did little to satiate her deep-seated hunger. Still, it was enough to give her the strength to wait until the canteens opened. As the hours passed, Sade roamed the streets, waiting for the canteens to come to life. Her stomach growled less, but the anticipation of a proper meal kept her going. The money she had received the night before now seemed like a lifeline, a small beacon of hope in her otherwise bleak existence. Sade's days became a cycle of hunger, survival, and fleeting moments of relief. Each morning, she would rise early, her stomach already aching with hunger. She would use a portion of whatever money she had to buy a small piece of bread or a few fruits from the market, savoring every bite as if it were a feast. Yet, the food never seemed to be enough, and the gnawing hunger remained a constant companion. Her days were spent wandering the streets, begging for food or money from passers-by. She quickly learned to recognize the sympathetic faces from the indifferent ones. Some people would give her a few coins or a piece of fruit, while others would ignore her completely, their eyes sliding past her as if she didn't exist. The rejection stung, but she forced herself to keep going, knowing that giving up wasn't an option. On better days, Shade would manage to collect enough money to buy a small meal from a street vendor. She cherished these meals, eating slowly to make the food last as long as possible. She would sit on a quiet corner, savoring every bite and feeling a momentary sense of peace. These small victories kept her spirit up, even though she knew the next day would bring the same struggle. One particular difficult day, Shade found herself with no money and no food. Her stomach growled loudly as she wandered through the market, her eyes scanning for any signs of kindness. She approached a vendor, an older woman with a kind face, and asked for a small piece of fruit. The woman looked at her sympathetically but shook her head. "I'm sorry, dear," the woman said, her voice gentle. "I can't give you anything for free. Times are hard for everyone." Shade nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She thanked the woman and moved on, her heart heavy. She continued to beg, but as the day wore on, it became clear that this was one of those days when luck wasn't on her side. By evening, she was exhausted, her legs aching from walking, and her stomach felt like it was tied in knots. She found a quiet alley and sat down, resting her back against the cool brick wall. Tears filled her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands, feeling utterly alone and defeated. The sounds of footsteps made her look up, and she saw a young boy approaching. He looked about her age, with a mischievous grin and a small bag slung over his shoulder. "Hey," he said, squatting down beside her. "You look like you could use some food." Shade nodded, wiping her tears. "I haven't eaten all day," she admitted, her voice trembling. The boy reached into his bag and pulled out a small loaf of bread and a piece of akara. "Here, take this," he said, handing it to her. "It's not much, but it should help." Shade took the food with trembling hands, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find the words to express her relief. The boy smiled. "I'm Tunde," he said. "I know what it's like to be hungry. My family isn't much better off, but we get by." Shade introduced herself, and they spent a few moments talking. For the first time in a long while, Shade felt a little hope. Tunde told her about a local shelter where she might be able to get more help before he bade her goodbye. The next morning, Shade woke up with a sense of anticipation. She hurriedly brushed herself off and set out towards the alley where she had met Tunde the day before, hoping against hope that she would find him there again. Her heart raced as she approached the familiar spot, but as she turned the corner, she was met with a cold, harsh reality. The alley was empty. Shade stood there for a while, her eyes scanning every inch of the alley, searching for a sign of Tunde. Maybe he was just running late, she thought. Maybe he would show up later. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the hours ticked by, her hope began to wane. Determined not to give up, Shade returned to the same spot the next day, and the day after that. For an entire week, she made her way to the alley each morning, her steps growing heavier with each visit. She waited and waited, but Tunde was nowhere to be found. The alley remained as desolate as ever, a stark reminder of her loneliness. With a heavy heart, Shade decided to follow through on Tunde's suggestion. She remembered him talking about a place near the outskirts of town where she might find help. The description he gave was vague, but Shade knew she had to try. With renewed determination, she made her way to the area he had mentioned. The place was under a large tree on the edge of town, a gathering spot for some men in the town. The area was lively in the evenings, with people gathered to play games, eat bushmeat, and drink palm wine after the day's work. Shade approached the spot tentatively, her eyes darting around as she took in the scene. The men were laughing and chatting animatedly, the aroma of roasting meat wafting through the air. Shade stood at the edge of the gathering, feeling like an outsider. She watched as people interacted, her stomach growling with hunger. The men were engrossed in their games and conversations, and it took her a while to muster the courage to approach them. Eventually, she approached a group of men who were sitting around a table, their voices raised in friendly banter. She cleared her throat softly and said, "Excuse me, sir, please. I'm very hungry and I'm looking for some help." The man looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. One of them, an older man with a kindly face, noticed her worn clothes and tear-streaked cheeks. He gestured for her to sit down. "Come, sit with us," he said. "What kind of help do you need?" Shade hesitated for a moment before explaining her situation. She told them about her mother's death, her struggles to survive, and the advice Tunde had given her. The men listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. The older man, whose name was Ade, nodded thoughtfully. "It's tough out here for people like you," he said, "but you're not alone." He gestured for one of the younger men to bring Shade a plate of food. "Here, have something to eat," he said gently. Shade's eyes filled with tears of gratitude as she accepted the food. As she ate, she felt a flicker of hope rekindle within her. Each day, Shade continued her routine, returning to the gathering spot under the tree where the men would often share their food with her. Though she never slept hungry again, her life remained marked by uncertainty and instability. The men around the tree who had grown fond of her occasionally offered her a portion of their bushmeat or bought her some food. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain her and provide a small glimmer of hope amidst her struggles. One day, the atmosphere around the tree was particularly lively. A man named Adaramola, affectionately known as Agba, due to his wisdom, vast experiences, and travels, had returned after several months away. The news of his return spread quickly, and the men gathered to celebrate his homecoming. They welcomed him warmly, recounting stories of his time abroad and expressing their joy at his return. As Agba joined the group, he noticed a little girl, Shade, who seemed to be a constant presence among them. Curiosity piqued, he observed her from a distance. She was always there, day in and day out, and he wondered about her presence. After a while, Agba approached some of the men and inquired, "Guys, what's up with this little girl? I've noticed her here since my return. Who is she and why is she always here?" One of the men, Ade, who had taken a particular interest in Sade's welfare, explained, "Agba, this little girl is Sade. She's an orphan. Her mother passed away and she's been struggling to survive ever since. She had no family to turn to, and she's been coming here for food and a place to find some comfort." Agba listened with a deepening sense of empathy. He looked over at Sade, who was sitting quietly, her eyes cast downward, seemingly resigned to her fate. Feeling a surge of compassion, Agba decided to speak with her directly. He approached Sade and said gently, "Little girl, how are you doing?" Sade looked up, surprised by his kind tone. "I'm fine, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Agba continued, "Is it true that you are an orphan and have no one to care for you?" "Yes, sir," Sade said, her eyes downcast. "I've been on my own since my mother died." Agba's heart ached at her words. He had seen too many hardships in his travels and knew the pain of loneliness all too well. Without hesitation, he offered, "Okay, how about you come live with me and my family? You shouldn't have to endure this on your own." Sade's eyes widened in disbelief. She had never imagined such an offer, and the thought of leaving the harsh reality of her current existence behind was overwhelming. For a moment, she could only stare at Agba, her emotions a whirlwind of hope and uncertainty. The men around her noticed her reaction and could see the joy spreading across her face. Ade placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and said, "It's a great offer, Sade. Agba's family is known for their kindness. This could be the opportunity you've been waiting for." With tears welling in her eyes, Sade looked at Agba and whispered, "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden, sir." Agba smiled warmly. "You won't be a burden. We have more than enough room, and my family will be glad to have you. It's the least we can do to help someone in need." Sade's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she felt a genuine sense of relief and hope. The weight of her daily struggles, the endless cycle of begging and fear seemed to lift as she thought about the possibility of a new beginning. As she prepared to leave with Agba, she glanced back at the gathering spot under the tree, the place that had become her refuge. The men who had become her surrogate family offered their well wishes and warm farewells. Sade thanked them profusely, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for their kindness. Agba and Sade set out towards his home, and the journey was filled with an unspoken sense of anticipation. Sade's heart beat with a mix of hope and nervousness, wondering what her life would be like. When they arrived at Agba's house, she was welcomed warmly by his family. The transition wasn't without its challenges, but Agba's family provided her with the comforts and care she had longed for. Sade's life began to change for the better. She no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from, or fear being thrown out by her landlord. Instead, she found solace in the warmth of Agba's family and the stability they provided. It wasn't just a roof over her head, but a chance to build a future filled with hope and promise. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Please drop a comment. Your comment keeps us motivated to do more. Thank you. And share with your friends and family. Also, subscribe for more interesting stories than this. See you in the next video. Goodbye.